for origin of species. We're just talking about how sympatric speciation can happen even when two species live in the same geographic area, and the fact that gene flow can actually be reduced by other factors, such as polyploidy that we just talked about in part one of the video. Now we'll talk about the second and third, which is sexual selection and habitat differentiation. So another sympatric speciation is through sexual selection. This is when an organism, typically females, will select mates based on their appearance. So for example, the female cichlid fishes actually like to select males based on their own body coloration. This actually resulted in two different cichlid species. So cichlids are fishes that look like this right here, and their breeding males of one species actually have a blue tinge back, while breeding males of the other species have a red tinge back. So here's that red tinge back cichlid, and then the red tinge back cichlid. And of course, those with blue will prefer to mate with blue. Those females with red tend to mate with those that are red. Hence, in a sense, mate choice was based on male breeding coloration. This was, in a sense, a reproductive barrier that kept the gene pools of these two species separate. So blue tinge-back females will not mate with red tinge-back. That's a reproductive barrier, and hence their gene flow won't happen, and their genes won't mix with each other because they won't mate with each other. That's why we can have two separate species of blue tinge-back cichlids and red tinge-back cichlids, even though they live in the same area. The last type of sympatric speciation we will discuss here is then habitat differentiation, which is when new species are formed when a subpopulation makes use of a habitat or resource that actually is not used by the parent population. So their habitat changes, and that's how you have development of a new species. So, for example, we already talked about this earlier. Apple maggot flies' original habitat was actually native hawthorn trees. And they actually changed its resource when apple trees were introduced by European settlers. So back in the day, they only had hawthorn trees, so these flies would only feed on hawthorn trees. But eventually, when apple trees were introduced, these flies were like, ooh, new source of food. So now they fly over to the apple tree side and mainly feed on apples. So this, in a sense, has created habitat isolation. Either apples versus hawthorn, and two different food source, in a sense, also mating location for these maggot flies. And then all in the same time, they also created temporal isolation. Because why is that? Remember, temporal isolation means that these particular species mate at different timing of the periods throughout the year, or maybe this mates in this 1 month, the other mates another month. Well, introduction of this apple trees also caused temporal isolation because apples tend to mature more quickly than hawthorn. So if they're able to form more apples quicker, these apple flies who feed mainly on the apples can also mate and interbreed and also produce progenies quicker. So that's why apples and those that feed on apples versus those that feed on hawthorn also will have this temporal isolation, where now they have become two different species that feed on different food source, meaning that they have this habitat differentiation, habitat change due to introduction of new environments in that sense. So here is a quick overview of the two main types of speciation. Allopatric speciation is where new species form in geographic isolation, meaning they're in two completely isolated area or location. That is what restricts the gene flow between the two species and prevents interbreeding. That's how you end up with two new species forming. Isolated regions, or those highly subdivided by barriers, tend to have more species. So We're talking about, let's say we have one lake somehow divide into 10 lakes, 10 little ponds instead of a whole huge pond. So that having more, the barriers will have more different species. Maybe instead of one species from the huge lake, now you have 10 different species in the 10 ponds. Thirdly, reproductive isolation between two populations generally increases as geographic distance between them increases, which means the farther they are apart, the more geographically isolated they will be, and the better that reproductive isolation. Now, even if these two species, let's say they've been separated for a long time, and somehow by accident they're able to meet again in the wild, these species will still be separate even when they come back into contact, because maybe because of natural selection or something, or even genetic drift, they have now developed traits that are very different from the original population, where they're like, oh, you don't look like me anymore. I cannot breed with you and or mate with you, and hence they will remain as two separate species even if they come back into contact after a while. All right. On the second, the other one, sympatric speciation is less common than allopatric speciation, which, we talked about those, odd methods such as polyploidy, which we already talked about them being more common in plants, doesn't happen in animals that often, or even humans for that matter. So it is a less common type of speciation, but it does happen. It requires reproductive barrier that isolates species in the same area, which means that they do live in the same geographic area, but there's got to be something that restricts gene flow between the two new species that's produced, or the two new species, as a result. Third, polyploidy, sexual selection, and habitat differentiation can result in those reproductive barrier, limit gene flow, and that's how we can have new species arise from sympatric speciation. So here's allopatric speciation, a barrier between the two that keeps the two species separate, and that's why you have new species evolving. And then sympatric speciation is where they live in the same area. There's no barrier between them, but somehow they will become two separate species due to these reasons we've talked about. So here's a quick video of how this happened, how the whole speciation process. So, and this particular video is about speciation of the anole lizards.
Two groups of animals are defined as different species when individuals from one group don't mate and reproduce with those from the other. One way a species can split into two is for populations to separate geographically. Over many generations, they can undergo enough changes in their respective habitats
A sympatric speciation.
that if and when they come back together again, they don't mate.
Allopatric speciation.
Now, suppose that a population of these lizards ended up in an area that was much more open and sunnier. In that case, a light-colored dewlap isn't very effective. So over time, the population would evolve by natural selection to have darker dewlaps.
If for some reason these two populations come together, the females would no longer recognize the males as members of the same species. They wouldn't mate. They would be reproductively isolated.
Ecological niches that we talked about.
Once new species have formed, competition drives the evolution of different body types. Species living in the same area compete for resources. But if members of one species move into another habitat, they can use resources not available to the other species. Over many generations, natural selection favors traits that enable species to occupy different habitats.
Okay, so that is an excellent video that kind of wraps up those concepts that we talked about, how speciation happens in animation form, whether geographically isolated or not. So the last main topic, like I said, this chapter shouldn't be that long. The last main topic for this chapter will be about hybrid zones. So what are hybrid zones? So if two species have incomplete reproductive barriers and were allowed to contact each other, then one possible outcome is formation of a hybrid zone. Hybrid zones are usually in regions where members of different species meet and mate to produce offspring of mixed ancestry. Gene flow happens within the hybrid zone. Um, Also, they typically are located wherever habitats of interbreeding species will meet, able to physically meet, which can be a narrow band or isolated scattered patches of land. Narrow band meaning narrow band of land between two habitats or environments, or they can actually have a patch here, a patch there, where these two species just tend to mingle and interbreed with each other. So, for example, yellow-bellied toad, like this picture right here, and fire-bellied toad, this picture right there, they're literally named for how they look like on their bellies. They are actually separated by a stretch of land where there's a higher altitude habitat, and they will meet the lowland habitat. So the yellow-bellied toad actually live in the higher altitude habitat, whereas the fire-belly toad, um, they actually live in the lowland habitats. But there exists this hybrid zone right there. So across that hybrid zone, this particular one, this narrow band of land, the two toads are actually able to intermingle with each other and interbreed a little bit. So the allele frequency specific to yellow-bellied toads goes from 100% at the edge of this highland altitude area to about 50% in the middle of that portion of the band, to where 0% when we get close to the fire-bellied toad lowland habitat area. So you see that the allele frequency kind of gradually decreased with the yellow-bellied toad from 100% down to 50 down to 0. But that means the alleles are present within this hybrid zone where they can interbreed and produce hybrids in this area. That's why there's this gradual loss of alleles for the yellow-bellied trait. So interestingly though, hybrid individuals rarely serve as stepping stone for alleles to be passed from one species to another. This means that, when we're talking about hybrids, usually not very much gene flow can go on, even though they do interbreed to produce these hybrids. And that can be due to multiple reasons. We'll talk about that in a bit. But this is due to because of, in the case of hybrid toads here, and we talk about this with the, frail hybrids or hybrids that are infertile, etc. They don't lead to, passing of alleles from one to the other. So in this case, the hybrid toads have increased rates of embryonic mortality, which means that embryos of these hybrids tend to die off. They don't develop into maturity. And then there are a variety of morphological abnormalities, even if they were born. So these abnormalities can lead to poor survival of those hybrids, or even probably can't be reproduced, for the next generation of hybrids to be formed. So even though they do these yellow-bellied toad and fire-bellied toad do interbreed and produce hybrids, many of them are not very viable. Okay? They are either not formed completely, they have abnormalities, or they don't survive. So that's why they rarely lead to passing one allele completely off to the other. So other facts about hybrid zones, any change in environmental conditions can cause an existing hybrid zone to move to a new location. So just because a hybrid zone is formed is not permanently there for years and years and years to come. They can actually be moved when certain events happens that changes the environment, and novel hybrid zones may actually form due to those changes. So one big example is climate change. So due to climate change, warmer weather have shifted hybrid zones of these beautiful chickadees further up north because they are trying to find places to escape the hotness, okay, or the warm weathers. So here's that these are this particular one is the black-capped chickadee, and this particular one is a Carolina chickadee, and they do interbreed in a hybrid zone that runs from Kansas to New Jersey. But in Pennsylvania, the center of this hybrid zone have been moved about 12 kilometers north from 2002 to 2012, the year of 2002 to the year of 2012. So this shift is all due to, again, climate change as the birds look for cooler weather. So that's why they are moving further up north. So climate change has a lot of impact in the environment. Not only we feel as human beings that temperatures are getting hotter, but it also affects hybrid zones and all the species that live in our environment today. So another example from warmer winters is that they resulted in species of flying squirrel. They also ended up expanding northward because it's too hot. Okay, the winters are now warmer. So now that by them moving northward, their species have overlapped with another species of flying squirrel, and again creating a novel hybrid zone in this case, all due to climate change. I mean, they wouldn't have moved if the winters weren't that warm, because some animals cannot adapt to their environment. Remember we said natural selection and adaptation is not species creating new variations to adapt to their environment, but variation that already exists in their population. In this case, flying squirrels can't tolerate warm winter. So what they do in response is they would go somewhere else to look for those cooler winters. So in some cases, hybrids formed in hybrid zones become reproductively isolated from their parents, and that's how they're able to form new species, such as what we talked about for quite a bit, was the polyploid plants, the goat beard, where we're able to form 2 new species from 3 species. So now instead of in that area having 3 species of Trigopodon, they now have 5 different species. So some polyploid plants actually can't interbreed with their parental species, and that's how they form a whole new species themselves. Now, in other cases, hybrids do not become reproductively isolated. They don't become reproductively isolated from parent species. So there can actually be 3 different outcomes for hybrid zones over time. You can have reinforcement of barriers, fusion of species, or stability, depending on how likely it is for the hybrids to survive. We'll talk about these 3 outcomes more in the next 2 slides. All right, let's start with reinforcement. So reinforcement means that formation of these less fit hybrids result in strengthening of the reproductive barriers. And strengthening means that's why it's reinforcement. So no hybrids are formed. Okay, so we already said some hybrids are just fragile, frail, and they are not very viable and can't survive or reproduce in the environment. So even though they're constantly formed, but no hybrids will prevail because of the fact that we cannot produce a lot of them to give rise to a whole new population. So hybrids are usually not very strong for survival, so that's what keeps the reproductive barriers between 2 populations stronger, and that's why we said it is reinforcement. Okay, they remain reproductively isolated. Now, this can happen when a specific speciation process leads to species that look very different from each other. And we've already talked about examples like that. And that's how we are able to make reproductive barriers stronger. Reproductive barriers are usually stronger for sympatric populations than allopatric populations. And for example, in allopatric population of flycatchers, beautiful birds like these, males of these two species usually closely resemble each other, whereas in sympatric population, the males will look very different like this. Okay, so due to these females not selecting males of the other species from sympatric populations, um, the fact that they look closely resemble each other in allopatric population, these females do make some mistakes when they are selecting their males. Okay, sometimes these particular different traits on the birds will also, you know, end up the female selecting different mates or males. Okay, whether they select from this breed versus the other breed. So that's why reproductive barriers are usually stronger from sympatric populations, because they tend to look a little more different compared to allopatric populations. So in these two cases, whether we're talking about flycatchers or anything like that, um, barriers to reproduction are stronger or reinforced in birds from sympatric population than in birds from allopatric population, because birds from sympatric populations have males that look different from each other. Second possible outcome of a hybrid zone is fusion. Fusion means that there is an increased gene flow in the hybrid zone, more gene flow between the hybrids and the two species that are forming these hybrids. So reproductive barriers are actually weakened in this case. The two hybridizing species actually fuse to become a single species, and the hybrids will prevail. A lot of hybrids will form. So for example, we talk about female cichlids' preference to mate with their own species color, male, where blue back ones will tend to mate with blue back males. Orange, red tinged back females will tend to mate with orange tinged back males. Now, very interestingly, results from the field or lab studies indicate that murky waters from pollution, again, that's another change in the environment that has caused fusion of hybrid, something different with the hybrid zone, just like climate change. In this case, it's pollution, and that made the water very murky and cloudy. That is what, in that sense, it reduced the ability for females to distinguish between male colors. So many hybrids were actually produced in this particular area, and because of the murky water and the fusion of parent species of the gene pool happen, and that equals to loss of species. So supposedly we would have these beautiful red tinged back cichlids versus blue tinged back, but because now your hybrids prevail, we have one species of now a mixture of the red tinge and the blue tinge existing in these murky waters. So when you fuse these two species together, you end up losing these two original species, and now you only have one in the pool. Okay, so that's what we mean by fusion of hybrid zones. It becomes all hybrids in that particular area due to weakening of the reproductive barrier. More gene flow happens. So again, this fusion occurs when reproductive barriers are weakened. Okay, in this case, we have pollution that ends up with murky waters, and two species will end up interbreeding more frequently, leading to hybrids prevailing in this particular area. A third possible outcome of hybrid zone is stability. If hybrids can survive or reproduce better than both parent species, hybrid zones can become stable. This is where both parent species and hybrids will continue to live and prevail in that particular area. Oddly enough, sometimes hybrids that are selected against are also resulting in stable hybrid zones, meaning that these hybrids are frail or they're actually not selected by natural selection to the environment, which means they're not best or favored for survival in that particular hybrid zone, but they still exist. Why that's the case? Well, first of all, let's talk about the example where this is the case. We go back to the yellow-bellied and fire-bellied toads. Hybrids actually continue to form between these two species within this hybrid zone, even though their survival and reproduction of these hybrids are very poor. Now, they say that one hypothesis is that it could be due to narrowness, or how narrow this hybrid zone is, so that both parent species constantly will migrate into this hybrid zone and mate with each other regardless, okay, unless they have another type of reproductive barrier, like that's pre-zygotic or something, no fertilization, and that's a different story. But it turns out that they can mate and fertilize the egg and sperm. So that's why, it's less likely, they will continuously interbreed to form these hybrids, even though the hybrids are selected against for in this particular hybrid zone. So they say that if this hybrid zone was a little wider, if this was to expand to a bigger region or something like that, this hybrid formation will definitely be less likely to occur. So they all, sort of explain this in terms of how narrow that hybrid zone is, and the toads will just jump into that hybrid zone regardless of, because of that, how small this area is. Hence, we have to discuss, how hybrid zones are formed and what are the three common outcomes for those hybrid zones over time. First, let's say, let me explain this beautiful picture here, the concept of how speciation happens with the hybrids. So first we have, let's say there are these three population of species that are connected by gene flow, and then a barrier to gene flow is established, whether it be reproductive barrier or pre-zygotic or post-zygotic, depending on the case, but a barrier is formed. So when one population begins to diverge from the other two, this color change, you see how it goes from blue to purple to pink, etc. This color change indicates that the isolated population continue to change and diverge over time. And later, if the gene flow was reestablished in the hybrid zone, then this will create hybrid individuals right there. Hybrid individuals. So this starts to diverge, and if these two species were allowed to interbreed within within the hybrid zone right there, then they will create these hybrid individuals. And if reinforcement happens, we talked about reinforcements as one possible outcome, then hybrids will gradually disappear because they're not, they're kind of weak and frail and they won't survive. Or fusion can happen, and that these two species will actually fuse and become one species. Third is stability, where hybrids will continue to be produced regardless whether they're selected for or against. They won't fuse together. They won't really reinforce where hybrids disappear. They will coexist as three brand new species, three species, where you have the hybrids and the parent species and the two parent species. Okay? That's what stability is. So lastly, we have discussed how the process of speciation can occur, but how long does it take approximately for new species to form? Because we've just talked about how what is the steps that lead to speciation. So how about how long does it take? Well, the patterns in the fossil record can give us some clues. There are actually records of new species suddenly appearing in the geologic stratum. They actually persist unchanged throughout the several strata and then all of a sudden disappear. That's what they see in the fossil records. This is what they call punctuated equilibria, which means, sort of punctuated equilibria, meaning that there's this species that are found, or fossils are found about this species at one time, and another time, and a third time. Then all of a sudden, without any change at all, they just disappear. So other species don't have this punctuated equilibrium. They may appear to have changed gradually over long periods of time. So they found that their species can sort of branch in these two different ways within the fossil records, because we can't observe them live, and that's what they see in those fossil records. So a punctuated pattern indicates that speciation occurred very rapidly, while gradual pattern indicates that speciation occurred very slowly. So here's a punctuated model. There was a very quick change in the species and leads to, one species disappearing. Whereas a gradual model, they gradually change in shape or certain way, and we can see presence of these gradual change stages within the fossils itself. And so this is concluded from the fact that short time periods, such as 50,000 years, well, that's not short. Well, with fossils, it is short. So we're talking about how long it takes for rocks to be formed, sediments to settle, things like that, and then compress into these strata we've talked about, into fossils. 50,000 years is not that long for them. So when we're talking about short time periods like this, they actually cannot be distinguished in fossil strata, due to how slow these sediments accumulation happens. So it's pretty slow process. So when things happen this fast, it ends up being a punctuated equilibria, where things looks as if they disappear completely, but they just have change. They change in their traits or morphology very quickly. We have already seen how fast speciation can happen in autopolyploid plants. In just one generation, that's all it took for that autopolyploid plants to form as a new species. So overall, time between speciation events averaged about 6.5 million years and was rarely less than 500,000 years, let alone 50,000 years that we talked about earlier. Now, we won't get into the details as to, how did they come up with these 6.5 million years and 500,000 years numbers. The book also didn't go too deep into it, but they say by studying fossils of many different species, this is what they come up with. So the overall speciation process is that it begins only after gene flow between population is interrupted by some sort of barriers, either changing environmental conditions or unpredictable events, depending on the case. And once gene flow is interrupted, population must diverge genetically, so they become reproductively isolated. Before then, if let's say there are other events that cause gene flow to resume, speciation can actually reverse. So we talk about how this particular guy here have diverged and form a whole new species. But let's say in some process, as it's sort of starting to change, gene flow was allowed to happen between these two species again, then this whole thing can actually stop and they can actually revert back to the original species. So this diverge of genetics has to happen so that no reverse of the organism can happen. This diverge of species have to happen before gene flow can occur between the two species again. Because once gene flow can happen between species, this whole process can reverse and go right back to the original population. So that's why we have to have these barriers that really isolate the species and allow for these divergence of genes that allow for traits to develop, new behaviors to develop, and classify them as two new species. Classify them as a whole new species. And that's all I have for you about speciation, chapter 24. So it's about 34 minutes. That's 1 hour 34. I promise that it will be short. So let's end this video with going over some practice questions from the chapter. Now, sea urchins are broadcast spawners. And we already talked about the red sea urchins and the purple sea urchins. They actually release their gametes into the water without any courtship. So which of these reproductive isolation mechanism is most likely to occur between sea urchins in the same area? Gametic isolation or temporal isolation? So remember we talked about how we said that these particular eggs can't be fertilized by another sea urchin sperm, specific species of sea urchin sperm, because of gametic isolation. They cannot ever form embryos because fertilization does not happen. Or let's say another orange or sea urchin or something, they release sperm at a specific time, and then another blue sea urchin, let's say, release egg at another specific time, then those sperm and egg will never develop. So temporal isolation can also happen in this case. You spot a sea snake while you are in a boat on the Atlantic Ocean and remark how similar it looks to a snake that lives in Arizona. However, you know that they are most likely separate species due to which of the following reproductive barriers? Habitat isolation. It's pretty interesting, right? So I guess next time you go out into a wild on vacation or something like that, especially if you're going overseas to another country, take a look around you, see what species of animals do you see or creatures do you see. And maybe you'll be like, oh, that looks kind of the same as what I see in the States, in America, but it looks slightly different. Well, now you can see them a little bit differently now that we've talked about speciation process. So snakes living in the ocean are most likely never going to come into contact with snakes living in the center of the continent, unless they can swim. But in this case, these particular snakes, um, these sea snakes can swim, but they were never going to be in contact with each other because of, they probably won't survive across the ocean from continent to continent. All right. The century cactus flowers every 100 years. A similar cactus flower every 50 years. If the 50-year cactus pollen has the correct characteristics to fertilize the century cactus, which reproductive barrier will most likely be working against the possibility? Temporal isolation. Well, because they produce flowers on different schedules, different timing of these years. Several species of amphibians are able to understand and respond to each other's mating rituals, tend to be fertile at the same time, and are usually similar in size. However, when they attempt to mate, they never produce offspring. Which of the following barriers is most likely the cause of this? Gametic isolation. Because the fact that the problem here says that they never produce offspring, which means they fail to create any offspring at all, gametic isolation would probably most likely be the cause. Why is it not reduced hybrid or hybrid breakdown? Well, the whole point is this problem says they never produce offspring. So these two are basing on the fact that they can produce, these species can produce hybrids. In this case, it is not true. So these options are not the correct ones. Now, behavioral isolation is also incorrect because it was stated in the problem that mating rituals are the same. They understand and respond to each other's mating ritual. That's why the only one we're left with is then the gametic isolation. The fossil record shows that many species remain constant for long periods of time, but then speciation episodes can occur rapidly. This is best described as what? Punctuated equilibrium. We just talked about that. It suggests that once the process of speciation begins, it can be completed relatively rapidly, so fast that fossil records don't even catch it. That particular gradual change in the species didn't even, was not even long enough for sedimentation to occur, for those strata to form within the rocks. Which of the following is believed to be the primary reproductive isolation mechanism for causing sympatric speciation in North American apple maggot flies? Habitat differentiation. We already talked about them having, hawthorn versus apple. So when apple trees were introduced, there's that habitat differentiation where they only prefer to mate and feed on apples versus any other fruits. The biological species concept relies on a disruption of which aspect of population genetics? Gene flow. Okay, remember we talked about how that in order for new species to arise, there must be either no gene flow or less amount of gene flow between the species such that they start to diverge from each other and form new species as a result. The other three, mutation, selection, and genetic drift, those were mentioned in the previous chapter. Now, bacteria reproduce primarily in an asexual manner. Accordingly, which species concept is difficult to apply to bacterial species? The biological species concept, because it relies on sexual reproduction, as we've talked about. It is the other concept that we can apply to asexual organisms. Euhodra is a genus of Japanese land snail in which some species have right-handed shell spirals and the other species have left-handed shell spirals. Snails with right-handed shells cannot physically mate with left-handed shell snails, which is the best hypothesis for an isolating barrier between right and left-handed Euhodra species. Mechanical isolation. Remember, if they don't spiral correctly, then the genitals don't align correctly and they will never be able to mate. Which of the following could facilitate allopatric speciation? All of the above, depending on the species. If that species cannot cross a mountain range, then they will remain separate. If that species can't cross a river, then they will never be able to swim across and they will remain separate. And the isthmus, they can't cross it, same thing. The ocean strait, same thing. Anything that impedes or blocks the species from interbreeding, that's how new species will arise, because that barrier is stopping gene flow from happening between the two species. The rutabaga is an allopolyploid species that originated in the northeastern Europe as a cross between its two parent species, cabbage, which has a diploid number of 18, and turnip with a diploid number of 20. How many chromosomes should rutabaga have then? 38. Remember that you have 2n of 18, which means their gametes, which is a haploid, will have 9. This particular species have 20 as their diploid chromosome number, so they will make gametes that are haploids with 10 10 chromosomes. So when these two combine, 9 plus 10, you have 19 haploids. Well, not 19 haploids, but haploids with 19 chromosomes. Okay? Haploids that have 19 chromosomes. So somehow, remember, in order for this to become a whole new species, mitotic, meiotic things should happen. So the errors can happen. Mitotic, meiotic errors can happen. And somehow it duplicated those 19 into 38 chromosomes. So this is n equals 19. Now 2n is equal to 38. So now you have a new species with 38 chromosomes. Okay. If you're unclear about this, go back to my goat beard example about allopolyploid species. Imagine a hybrid zone between two sister species that constantly interbreed such that gene flow between two species is increased. Which of the following is likely a consequence of the hybrid zone? Gene flow between the two species is increased. So, hybrid continue to mate with both original species, leading to fusion of the two original species. Because gene flow between the two species is increased, they will eventually become one species. As long as gene flow happens, you always then have one species. Only time when you can have two different species according to biological species concept is when gene flow is limited or completely eradicated. And that is all I have for you for chapter 24 on the origin of species.